Australian South Sea Islanders, or the descendants of the South Sea Islanders that were brought here through the blackbirding trade, were thrown under the same legislations as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Australians. That trade began in New South Wales in 1847 with Benjamin Boyd, who brought the first lot of Melanesian labourers illegally to New South Wales, Eden, to work on the whaling industry with Aboriginal and Maori brothers and sisters. And that was a human disaster. And then the influx came into Queensland in 1863, something like 62,000 contracts of Melanesian labourers to establish the economical base of this country.
The term stolen wages actually covers quite a range of financial abuses. Now, in 1960, these racially discriminatory clauses within social security legislation, Commonwealth social security legislation, were repealed. That meant that overnight, tens of thousands of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders across Australia became eligible for old age pensions. The pension monies were paid to what were called warranties. So the warranties were the station owners or the station managers, the mission superintendents. The warranties were supposed to bank the money, give the old age pensioners what was called a pocket money component. And that term pocket money is actually in the legislation, that's what they called it. But in most instances, this money just went into station coffers or into the mission accounts, and the old age pensioners for whom the money was intended never saw any benefit from it. The Western Australian government in 2012 set up a reparations scheme that was so limited that only a fraction of Aboriginal people, Aboriginal workers and their families who suffered financial abuse, only a small fraction of those people were actually eligible to apply for this payment, and it was a one-off $2,000 payment. And you see, for Aboriginal pastoral workers who were substantially underpaid for, well, really for 3/4 of the 20th century, it's actually not difficult to work out how much they're owed or how much people's forebears should have been paid. And certainly there are people still alive who worked under that system where they were paid way less than award wages. That doesn't seem to me to be fair at all.
We're not making it up. The deceased estate wages of some 15,000 that died in this country who had bank accounts went to the Commonwealth. You know, £6 a year, equivalent of $20 today. And if they died, the money stayed in the bank accounts with the intent of it being returned to the families. It was never returned. They were absorbed back into the Commonwealth. Some of those funds went towards setting up the Kanaka missionaries across Australia or up in far north Queensland and in the Torres Strait. But the majority of it went into managing, the trade out of the country, deportation and, just absorbed back. So interest today is 38 million Australian dollars that's due for Australian South Sea Islanders. Deportation with the 1901 Pacific Island Labourers Act, wanting to, have a white Australia. Deporting after a 40-year period and just oust. And on top of that, they had to pay for their half of their return fare. In 1901, the White Australia policy, the nation was established, it was cleared, the land was cleared, so there's no need to, keep importing. And then you had the workers' union who were complaining about, they needing white labour, white jobs for white people. And so, of course, it's a discriminatory act. They didn't care. We could be discarded as animals, I mean, they're saying it's not slavery. Then what is it when you just deport en masse something like 10,000 people, with no notice, and then, of course, white Australians come in and just take those jobs, and the evidence is there in the National Film Sound Archives with pride of white Australians being able to cut sugarcane and all of this sort of hype around, but they don't tell the truth about who actually laid the foundation or stripped the country back to enable those crops to be grown in the first place. And it's not just sugarcane, it's maritime pastoral industries, you know. We all work together as black people, as people of colour, to establish this nation, you know, under a slave trade.
The term stolen wages actually covers quite a range of financial abuses. You have a system of unpaid or really low-paid labour. That primarily affected pastoral station workers, where people actually weren't paid any wages at all, or their wages were so low that they were just a fraction of the award. And that was a system that was supported by governance regimes at the time. For a lot of workers in Western Australia, that continued right through until the late 1960s.
When you look at the poverty within Indigenous communities, the fact that there's so little that people had to hand down in a material sense from, generally money that should have been paid was either collected by the welfare boards so that they could use it for the furtherance of their own agendas. A lot of it just went into general revenue, soaked up into the general funds of government. Money that should have gone to Aboriginal workers in these circumstances was used to continue to remove children. And when you think that this was a policy that sort of went from the 1880s informally through to a very strong state structure by the early 1900s, right into the 1960s, you're talking about generations. So you can even conceive where people would have been funding these bodies that would then come and take their own children, being funded by the exploitation of Aboriginal people's labour and their lands. It starts to just become an extra layer of how disturbing these policies were. You think of the amount that they're paying in terms of what the amount of wages should have been in real terms now, looking at what people should have been paid over these decades. It's such a fraction. It's such a fraction of what people were really owed. And I think that's where the difficulty is. It's such a small amount to compensate for what people have suffered. And the idea that a reparations scheme can in any way set you right when these things have happened to people basically from when they were children, literally from when they were children. Reparations schemes can't do that. They fall short. And so in some ways that's the danger in the politics of them, that it does give people a sense of, well, we've done the right thing. That's been put to bed. And I think in a way that can further minimise the harm that people continue to suffer post being given a small amount of a financial reward for horrors that they suffered decades ago and have had to live with ever since.